shouldn't have gotten on that ship. It wasn't a disaster. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a riot. It was something else.
She's here.
You're not afraid. You just haven't realized that you belong to me yet. Why resist? You're already one of us.
No!
You've never been alone.
The Empire did not fall in a single night. It decayed, its bones hollowed out by greed, cowardice, and silence. I was there when the cracks began to show. I was a soldier, one of thousands aboard the Vigilant Dawn, a warship the size of a city, drifting along the outer fringes of Imperial space. We had once been the hammer of the Empire, a symbol of its dominion over the void. Now we were a ship without orders, drifting through the carcass of a dying regime. First, the supply lines failed. There were whispers among the crew, rumors of entire fleets vanishing, colonies going dark with no distress signals. Some said it was mutiny. Warlords carving out their own fiefdoms in the chaos. Others swore there was something else out there, something worse. Whatever the truth was, Command did not tell us. They fed us platitudes, promises of reinforcements, orders to remain on standby. Weeks passed, then months. We heard nothing. Then came the wreck. It was the Imperial Wrath, a ship that had vanished from the fleet nearly 6 months prior. Its massive form drifted lifelessly in the void, tumbling through the blackness like a corpse frozen in time. Its hull was torn open, great wounds of twisted metal exposing the ship's innards to the stars. There were no distress beacons, no automated signals. It was dead. We should have left it alone. But protocol dictated otherwise. Captain Varlin ordered a boarding party, my squad. We crossed the void in silence, our shuttle's thrusters barely a whisper against the abyss. The Wrath loomed ahead, its darkened corridors gaping like an open mouth. As we made contact, the docking clamps locked onto dead steel, and the airlock hissed open. I remember the first thing that struck me as we stepped inside. The smell. A battleship that had been drifting for months should have smelled of stale air, rusted metal, and the cold sterility of vacuum. But the Wrath smelled wrong, like something organic, something rotting. The air was thick, cloying, and damp, as if the ship itself had begun to decompose. We moved forward, our boots echoing against the grated floor. The emergency lighting flickered, casting everything in a sickly red glow. We found no bodies, only uniforms, shredded and strewn across the floor, as if the crew had been stripped away but left their clothes behind. The walls bore strange marks, deep scratches, long and uneven, gouged into the metal as if something massive had torn its way through the corridors. The deeper we went, the more we saw. Control panels were shattered, doors warped and bent inward. Some of the rooms were wet, not with blood, but with something thicker, something black. It clung to the walls, pulsed beneath the dim lighting. I touched it once. My gloves burned for hours afterward. Sergeant Rourke, a man I had fought beside for years, broke the silence first. "This ain't right," he muttered, tightening his grip on his rifle. His voice was steady, but I could see the sweat beading on his brow. We found the bridge last, or what was left of it. The captain's chair was empty, but the surrounding walls were covered in a growth, something dark and fibrous, something alive. The command terminals were fused into the mass, screens flickering erratically, pulsing in time with the thing that had taken root. And in the center, where the crew should have been, there was only a pile of twisted, glistening remains. Not bodies, not even bones, but fragments. Fingers fused together, teeth embedded in soft tissue, scraps of flesh stretched unnaturally thin. And then I saw it. Movement. Something shifted within the mass, something long and sinuous, sliding beneath the surface. I heard breathing, deep and slow, as if the ship itself were drawing air into its dead lungs. My skin crawled. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I wasn't the only one. "We need to go," Rourke said, his voice low and tight. But the second we turned back toward the corridor, the ship shuddered. Not from an impact, not from an external force. It was alive. The lights surged, flickering in violent strobes. A sound filled the air, low, resonant, almost vocal. It was not an alarm. It was a call. Something answered. From the corridors we had passed through, from the open vents, from the very walls themselves, they emerged, things that had once been human, their forms twisted, elongated, their flesh fused with something dark and wet and wrong. Their faces were half-formed, mouths gaping, eyes blackened pits. They did not move like men. They shambled, twitched, lurched toward us in unison, their bodies breaking as they forced themselves forward. We opened fire. The shots tore into them, but there was no blood, only the splatter of something thick and tar-like. The bodies twitched, convulsed, but did not die. "Fall back," Varlen's voice cut through the chaos. We ran back through the ship, through the corridors that had seemed empty moments before. Now they were filled with the sound of pursuit, wet, scraping, unnatural. As we neared the airlock, the Wrath trembled. The walls contracted, pulsing as if the entire ship were taking a breath. Something massive stirred deep within, something beyond the reach of our flashlights. I barely made it through the hatch. The moment we were inside, the shuttle pilot disengaged the clamps, fired the thrusters, and sent us rocketing away from the dead ship. For a moment, as we drifted away, I saw the Wrath's shattered hull pulse again, the flickering lights forming something almost like an eye. Watching, waiting. We returned to the Vigilant Dawn in silence. There was no debriefing, no discussion. Captain Varlen sealed the logs, declared the Wrath a lost ship, and forbade any further contact. The crew asked questions, but none of us had answers. All we knew was that something had happened to that ship, something that had turned its crew into that, something that was still out there, waiting. We left the Imperial Wrath behind, but it did not leave us. The Vigilant Dawn drifted through the void, its engines quiet, its corridors hushed with the kind of silence that felt like waiting. The wreck was gone, lost to the darkness, but the weight of it remained. No one spoke of what we had seen, of the broken bodies, the shifting black mass, the thing that had moved within. Even Captain Varlen, who had ordered the boarding mission, refused to mention it in the official logs. But something had followed us. It started with the static. The comms flickered, short bursts of interference cutting through transmissions. The sound was faint at first, nothing more than a whisper of white noise in the background of routine reports. The tech crews dismissed it as residual feedback from the wreck, a minor malfunction in the comms array. But then, the static changed. It became rhythmic. I was on watch when I first heard it, alone in the dim glow of the bridge monitors, staring at the endless stretch of space beyond the viewing deck. The others had long since turned in, but I couldn't sleep. The events aboard the Wrath played over in my mind, looping endlessly. The hollow uniforms, the flickering lights, the glistening shapes that had once been men. Then the static crackled in my earpiece. It wasn't random. There was a pattern, something deliberate within the interference. I adjusted the frequency, fingers moving on instinct, and the static pulsed in response. It was a voice, a woman's voice. It was soft, almost melodic, just beneath the noise. I strained to make out the words, but they slipped away like whispers through water. Hear me. A chill ran down my spine. I yanked off the headset, my breath coming too fast. The bridge was silent again, nothing but the hum of the ship's systems. I turned back to the monitors, half convinced I had imagined it. Then the lights flickered, just for a second, a small surge, barely noticeable. But I knew someone or something was speaking to me. I wasn't the only one. The next day, Lieutenant Orlin collapsed in the mess hall. He was a solid man, disciplined, a soldier who had seen combat on more worlds than I could count. But when he hit the floor, he started whispering. Not in fear, in reverence. "They are here," he murmured, fingers twitching, his eyes staring at something the rest of us couldn't see. "She is here." We carried him to the infirmary, but the whispers spread. First, just a handful of crew members, engineers, navigators, even security officers. Then more. By the end of the week, nearly half the ship had heard the voice. They spoke in unison, eyes distant, heads tilting slightly as if listening to a sound that only they could hear. They did not resist orders. They did not panic. They simply changed. And then they began to smile. It was the smiles that unnerved me the most, too wide, too still, as if their faces had forgotten what true expression was, only mimicking something that used to be human. Sergeant Rourke and I locked ourselves in the barracks, barricading the doors. We weren't alone. There were still a handful of us unaffected. We shared the same fear, the same questions that none of us could answer. What had followed us from the Wrath? Who was the voice that spoke in the dark? And why did the others look at us as if they knew something we didn't? Then, on the 8th night, I woke up to find Rourke standing by the door. His back was to me, his head tilted toward the intercom panel, listening. "Rourke," I whispered. He didn't turn around. I stepped closer, heart hammering. His breathing was slow, too controlled. His fingers twitched. "Rourke." He turned. His eyes were black. Not fully, not yet, but the darkness had begun to seep into them, creeping from the edges of his irises, swallowing the color. "She's waiting," he said, his voice layered, doubled over itself. "You don't have to fight it." I backed away, fingers tightening around my sidearm. Something shifted under his skin. A ripple, a movement that should not have been there. I ran. Through the barracks, through the corridors, past the whispering crew members who did not even look at me as I passed. They were waiting, watching. patient. The air was thick now, damp and warm, filled with a scent I couldn't quite name. Not blood, not decay, something older. I reached the maintenance tunnels, sealing the hatch behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my thoughts spiraling. The whispers, the smiles, the eyes turning black. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to steady myself. My skin felt wrong, too warm, too soft. I pulled my hand away. Beneath my nails, the flesh was dark. It was inside me, and it was spreading. I had been running for hours, or maybe it had only been minutes. Time stretched and folded in the darkened maintenance tunnels, broken only by the occasional flickering of emergency lights. My breath was ragged, my hands slick with sweat, my mind racing. I wasn't alone down here. The ship groaned around me, a deep shuddering noise that did not belong to metal or machinery. The walls had started to change, slick in places where they should have been dry, pulsing faintly under my touch. I could hear something moving through the ducts above, something shifting, pressing, breathing. And inside me, something else had begun to stir. I glanced down at my hands, flexing my fingers. The blackness beneath my nails had spread, tracing the veins of my wrists like ink seeping through paper. My skin felt loose, tingling as if something small and writhing had burrowed just beneath the surface. I gritted my teeth. Number, not yet. The others had given in. The crew had surrendered to the Arbiter, letting her voice fill their minds, letting her shape them into something more. I had seen them. Lieutenant Orlin, who once led boarding parties without fear, now a silent disciple, his eyes black as void. The engineers who whispered in unison as they worked on machines that no longer served the Empire but something else. And Rourke, who had fought beside me for years, Rourke, whose body was no longer his own. I had found him, or what was left of him, near the reactor core. His skin had split open like old fabric, revealing something new beneath. His fingers had lengthened, stretched into something almost skeletal, tipped with jagged black bone. His chest had caved inward, then expanded again, his ribs moving like the gills of some deep-sea predator. But it was still him. I could see it in the way he moved, the way his head tilted when he looked at me, as if he still recognized what we had been before all of this. "She remakes us," he had said, his voice layered, distorted, something else speaking through him. "You don't have to fight." I had raised my weapon. He hadn't flinched, and then I had run. Now, alone in the tunnels, I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breath. I couldn't go back. The upper decks were lost. The bridge was silent. The captain was either dead or worse. There was no one left to give orders, no one left to lead. Only her, the Arbiter. She was no goddess, no machine intelligence, no spectral horror from ancient myth. She was alive, a thing older than the Empire itself, something that did not conquer with warships and weapons, but with whispers and touch. She did not kill her victims, she changed them. And the ship, the Vigilant Dawn, was changing with them. The corridors had begun to shift, the bulkheads twisting, no longer the cold, sterile metal of Imperial design. The walls were lined with something dark and sinewy, something that pulsed in rhythm with the distant heartbeat of the ship's failing core. The vents exhaled warm, damp air, carrying the scent of something organic, something rotting, or something being born. I clenched my fists, my nails scraped against my palms. Too sharp now, too black. I could feel the pressure inside my skin, something waiting. I had a choice. Let go, surrender, become something else, or fight. I took a slow breath. The Arbiter had devoured the broken remnants of the Empire. She had taken the lost and the desperate, the abandoned and the hopeless, and reshaped them in her image. But I was not broken yet. I gripped my weapon, checked the charge, and pushed forward, toward the heart of the ship, toward her. The Vigilant Dawn was no longer a ship. It had become something else. The corridors breathed, pulsing with dark veins that ran along the walls like roots burrowing into dead steel. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of damp earth and raw meat. Overhead, the emergency lights flickered weakly, casting brief glimpses of the shifting mass that had overtaken the bulkheads. It was growing, expanding, a slow, patient corruption. And I was running out of time. I forced myself forward, down the main passage toward the reactor chamber, the heart of the ship. The airlock to engineering had already warped, its frame swollen with dark tissue. It shuddered as I approached, as if it knew I was coming. I could hear them, the crew. They had gathered beyond the threshold, their voices humming in unison. A sound that wasn't a chant, nor a song, but something in between. A resonance that vibrated in my skull, in my bones, and underneath it all, her. The Arbiter's voice, software gentle. Come! I gritted my teeth, raising my weapon. The rifle felt heavier in my hands. My fingers didn't grip it the way they used to. The blackness had spread up my arms now, threading through my veins like ink in water. My pulse was slower, my breathing steadier. It was inside me, changing me. I wasn't sure how much longer I had before I became one of them. I forced my way through the half-sealed doors. The reactor chamber was no longer just machinery and steel. It was something alive. Tendrils of dark flesh wove through the walls, curling around the coolant pipes, embedding themselves in the main power conduits. The control terminals were fused into the mass, their screens flickering with symbols that weren't human, weren't anything I could comprehend. And in the center, standing in the hollowed remains of the command platform, was her, the Arbiter. She was not a god. She was not a machine. She was something else. Her form was fluid, shifting between shapes, between silhouettes, between faces. Sometimes human, sometimes something far from it. She was beautiful and terrible all at once, her body shimmering as if she were only half real, only half here. And she was watching me. The crew stood beside her, those who had surrendered, those who had given in. Rourke was among them, his body twisted but whole, his new limbs folded neatly against his sides. Orlan, too, his blackened eyes full of knowing. They did not attack, they did not threaten. They waited. You came, the Arbiter said, her voice smooth, rich, something that pressed against the inside of my skull. I knew you would. I aimed my rifle at her. My hands shook. She only smiled. You are already one of us, she whispered. Why fight? I wanted to pull the trigger. I needed to pull the trigger, but I couldn't. My body was betraying me. My breath was steady, too steady, my pulse synchronized with the hum of the reactor, with the rhythm of her voice. The change inside me was nearly complete. I had minutes left, maybe seconds. She took a step forward. Her hand reached out, her fingers long and delicate, dark veins running just beneath the skin. She touched my cheek. It was warm, gentle, a kindness that felt wrong. "There is no pain," she said. "No suffering, no war, only purpose, only unity." I swallowed hard. "They were lost," she continued, glancing at the crew behind her. "Forgotten, left to drift, left to die." Her gaze returned to me. "I gave them more. I can give you more, too. A future without war, without loneliness, without fear." That was what she promised. I looked at Rourke. His black eyes met mine. There was no anger in them, no sorrow, only acceptance. Was this what he wanted, or was he simply too far gone to remember wanting anything at all? I thought of the Empire, of the years I had spent fighting for something that had crumbled long before the first shots were fired. The orders, the missions, the lies, the commanders who sent men to die while they sat safely behind their steel walls. What was I really fighting for now? Nothing was left but this ship, this moment, and a choice: surrender or resist. The reactor pulsed, the ship breathed. The Arbiter's hand remained against my face, warm and steady. I closed my eyes and I made my choice. The rifle fell from my fingers. I reached for the detonator at my belt. Her expression flickered, just for a second. Shock, understanding. The explosion was instant. The core ruptured, the ship's dying heart tearing itself apart in a violent wave of energy. The Arbiter screamed. The crew screamed with her. The walls split open, flesh and metal shattering in unison. Fire ripped through the chamber, consuming the tendrils, the growths, the thing she had made the ship into. And then, silence, weightlessness, darkness. I was floating. The debris field of the vigilant dawn stretched around me, broken steel and shattered bodies spinning endlessly through the void. The Arbiter was gone. The ship was gone. And yet, I was still here. I should have died in the blast. I should have burned with the rest of them. But my body was still intact. I looked at my hands. The blackness had not receded. The transformation had not stopped. I was no longer a soldier, no longer human. She had remade me, after all. Even in death, she had won. I drifted through the cold emptiness of space, watching the ruins of the vigilant dawn scatter among the stars. The Empire was gone. The Arbiter was gone. And yet her voice still lingered in my mind. Software gentle. "You were never meant to be alone." I closed my blackened eyes, and I smiled.